The camera glides over turquoise water so clear it looks photoshopped, except the island beneath it is very real and very done with surviving 5 centuries of colonial chaos. This is Euromine, called Saint Vincent by the people who discovered it in 1498, which is historian speak for sailed past an island already full of humans and took notes like they owned the place. Classic. On the horizon rises La Soufrière, ancient and unbothered, the kind of volcanic giant that looks like it judges empires from above. Below it stretches a landscape of ridges, cliffs, and forest so dense that in the 1700s, British soldiers described it as nearly impenetrable, which conveniently made it the perfect stronghold for the Garifuna, the Afro-Indigenous people who would fight 7 wars. Yes, 7, against the British, and win so convincingly in spirit that the empire's solution was exile. The year is 1795 for our anchor moment, and Paramount Chief Joseph Chattoyier stands at Dorsetshire Hill, planning a coordinated night assault with French revolutionary allies. A British officer will later complain in a military report that the Black Caribs fight as ghosts in the very mountains. The forests around us seem to remember that line. The waves lap gently. The sky glows pink. The beauty is disarming. And yet, every path, every ridge, every ravine here has carried the footsteps of people who refused to disappear. The island is quiet now, but trust me, these mountains have seen things. Long before anyone thought to draw borders on parchment, the Kalinago people lived along the windward and leeward coasts of Euromine in villages of communal longhouses where cassava was grated on stone boards, fish were smoked over driftwood fires, and governance happened through councils rather than crowns. The island provided abundantly, seas full of snapper and kingfish, forests yielding iguana and agouti, volcanic soil perfect for root vegetables that could feed families for months when properly stored. French Dominican missionary Raymond Breton, visiting in the mid-1600s, recorded ethnographic details of Kalinago life with the kind of clinical fascination Europeans reserved for cultures they didn't understand but couldn't help studying. He noted their sophisticated canoe construction, their astronomical knowledge for ocean navigation, their medicinal plant expertise that European doctors would later plagiarize without credit. The Kalinago weren't isolated. They traded across the Lesser Antilles in dugout canoes that could cross open ocean, carrying pottery, tools, woven goods, and stories between islands from Dominica to Grenada. Their cosmology centered the natural world, ancestor reverence woven into seasonal rituals that marked planting, harvesting, and hurricane preparation. Social organization emphasized collective decision-making, with chiefs earning authority through demonstrated wisdom rather than hereditary claim alone. Women held significant power in household economics and child-rearing, their labor in agriculture and craft production essential to community survival. Then came the shipwrecks. Starting in the early 1600s, enslaved Africans fleeing or surviving wrecks of Spanish and Portuguese vessels found refuge on Euromine's shores. Some swam from sinking ships. Others escaped during storms that drove slave vessels onto rocks. The Kalinago absorbed them into kinship networks, and over generations, a new people emerged. The Garifuna, blending African agricultural techniques with indigenous fishing mastery, creating matrifocal households where women held land and men navigated both forest and sea. Archaeological records from sites near modern Argyll show evidence of this cultural fusion. Ceramic styles shifting to include African decorative patterns, burial practices evolving to incorporate West African spiritual elements, tool technologies merging into hybrid forms. Linguists have documented how Garifuna language developed. maintaining Kalinago grammatical structures while incorporating Yoruba, Igbo, and other West African vocabulary, creating something entirely new that belonged to neither ancestral tradition but to the people forging identity in a new world that was actually very old to those already living there. So yes, societies existed before Europe arrived. Functioning ones. With food security, trade networks, spiritual systems, governance structures, and zero paperwork. The calm wouldn't last, because it never does when empires start eyeing islands they want to own. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, Garifuna communities had established themselves firmly in the windward strongholds of Sandy Bay and Owia, where steep terrain made surveillance nearly impossible, and fertile valleys sustained crops of yams, plantains, and maize brought from West African agricultural traditions. The coastal areas provided fishing grounds where Garifuna men demonstrated mastery of both indigenous and African maritime techniques, reading currents and weather patterns that allowed them to fish farther offshore than European settlers dared venture. French trader Jean-Baptiste Dutertre documented his observations of Garifuna political councils operating through consensus rather than autocracy, with decisions made collectively and leadership earned through demonstrated wisdom, military skill, and ability to maintain community cohesion rather than inherited titles. Women controlled household economies, and land inheritance followed maternal lines, a structure that baffled European observers accustomed to patriarchal property systems, where women were essentially property themselves. Garifuna women managed agricultural production, controlled food distribution, arranged marriages, and maintained the spiritual knowledge that connected communities to ancestors. Their authority wasn't symbolic. It was economic and social power that men respected because survival depended on it. Spiritually, the Garifuna developed the Dugu ceremony, a ritual of ancestor communication that blended Kalinago cosmology with West African spiritual technologies, creating something that belonged wholly to neither tradition but to the new culture forged in refuge. The Dugu involved drumming patterns that carried messages across miles, dance movements that invoked specific ancestors, and communal feasting that reinforced social bonds. These weren't quaint customs. They were sophisticated cultural technologies for maintaining group identity and transmitting knowledge across generations without written records. Their canoes, carved from single silk cotton trees and capable of holding 20 warriors or fishermen, dominated the coastal waters. Construction required months of work, selecting the right tree, burning and scraping the interior, shaping the hull for ocean stability, carving intricate designs that identified each craft's village origin. These canoes allowed Garifuna communities to maintain contact with each other, conduct trade, and respond quickly to threats by moving warriors rapidly along the coastline. Oral histories passed down through generations speak of migrations to Baliso, the small island visible from Urumain's southern coast, used as fishing grounds, ritual spaces, and emergency refuge during hurricanes. The Garifuna weren't waiting for empire to notice them. They were building a civilization on their own terms, rooted in land they defended and seas they mastered, creating cultural practices that would survive everything empire could throw at them. Cultures evolve through connection, not conquest. But empires have a way of noticing peaceful islands, and that's when problems begin. When Christopher Columbus sailed past Urumain on January 22, 1498, eye-roll obligatory, he didn't bother landing, which meant the island enjoyed a few more decades of autonomy, while Spain focused on extracting gold from larger territories like Hispaniola and later Peru. Columbus named the island San Vicente without consulting anyone actually living there, a pattern that would repeat for centuries, Europeans pointing at places, saying words, and acting like verbal declaration equaled ownership. By the early 1700s, both France and Britain wanted Saint Vincent on paper, signing treaties that divided the island between themselves while conveniently ignoring the fact that neither power actually controlled it. The 1660 Treaty of Paris designated Saint Vincent as neutral territory, belonging theoretically to the Caribs, but European definitions of neutral rarely meant what indigenous peoples hoped. French Governor Charles Houel attempted small settlements in the 1700s, but colonial correspondence from the period reveals constant complaints that the island remained intractable and impossible to govern. One French official wrote in 1719 that the savages refuse all instruction in proper agriculture and maintain their independence with an insolence that borders on military threat. The Garifuna and Kalinago maintained de facto sovereignty, occasionally trading with French merchants, accepting metal tools, cloth, and rum in exchange for tropical hardwoods, cotton, and provisions, but never surrendering political authority or allowing permanent French settlements in their territories. Colonial logic operated on a simple principle. If you can draw it on a map, you own it. Actual island logic ran differently. Try it. French planters established tentative footholds in the leeward valleys near the coast, but any attempt to expand inland met coordinated resistance. The forest itself seemed to conspire against European ambitions, trails disappearing overnight as Garifuna communities deliberately obscured paths, supplies vanishing in raids so swift. European guards never saw attackers. Surveyors getting lost in terrain, the Garifuna navigated effortlessly even in darkness. European maps of the interior remained blank or inaccurate, filled with notations like impenetrable forest and hostile natives, cartographic admissions of failure. Neither France nor Britain could claim they governed Yurumain because governance requires presence, and presence requires the consent of people who actually live somewhere. That consent was never given. European control extended exactly as far as their cannons could fire from coastal forts, and not an inch further. Sovereignty existed long before treaties, maintained through daily acts of refusal and strategic violence that made European expansion too expensive to sustain. But empire always escalates, especially when profitable crops are involved. The First Garifuna War, counted as such in oral tradition, began around 1719 when French planters tried establishing sugar estates in the leeward valleys near Chattoyier, clearing forest for cane fields without permission or negotiation. Sugar had transformed the Caribbean from scattered colonial outposts into industrial death machines, and France wanted Saint Vincent to join the production system that was making merchants in Bordeaux extraordinarily wealthy while grinding enslaved Africans into early graves. Chief Kitson, a Garifuna leader documented in French military dispatches, organized raids that destroyed surveying equipment, burned isolated plantation buildings, and made it clear that expansion would be resisted at every turn. The raids followed patterns. Hit before dawn, target the most vulnerable settlements, destroy property but generally avoid killing unless absolutely necessary, vanish before military response could organize. This wasn't mindless violence. It was calculated political messaging that said expansion costs more than it's worth. The French responded with soldiers who quickly learned that European military tactics meant nothing in dense tropical forest against fighters who knew every ridge and ravine. French troops trained for battlefield formations discovered that forests don't have battlefields, just ambush points. They wore heavy uniforms in tropical heat and carried equipment designed for European warfare. Muskets that took a minute to reload, powder that got damp in humidity, supplies that required wagon roads that didn't exist. Warning fires appeared on mountainsides at night, a communication system the French couldn't decipher, but correctly interpreted as coordination. Garifuna lookouts stationed on ridges would light fires signaling French troop movements, allowing communities to evacuate or prepare ambushes hours before soldiers arrived. The fire network operated faster than any European courier system. By 1748, after nearly 3 decades of intermittent conflict, the French had managed to hold only coastal settlements, their grand plantation dreams stalled by persistent strategic resistance. French reports from the period describe unprovoked attacks, which translated from colonial doublespeak means we tried to steal land and people defended it. One French military report complained that the Black Caribs refused to understand the benefits of civilization and persist in savagery, by which they meant the Garifuna refused to become enslaved labor for someone else's profit. While the French drew plantation plans, the Garifuna drew a line. This was resistance as policy, not passion. Every burned storehouse, every abandoned survey, every French retreat represented Garifuna political success. But Britain was watching across the Channel, and Britain wanted everything France had failed to take. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the 7 Years' War and, as a side effect, transferred Saint Vincent from French to British control, a transaction conducted entirely in European capitals between governments who'd never controlled the interior. British Governor George Melville arrived in 1764 with surveyors, land grants already printed for loyal subjects who'd served in the war, and a confidence entirely unearned by actual territorial authority. The British had watched France fail for decades and concluded, with characteristic imperial arrogance, that they would succeed where France hadn't because they were British and therefore superior. Spoiler. This goes exactly how you think it does. The British immediately began aggressive surveying, sending teams inland to map and measure land for sugar estates, operating under the assumption that Indigenous and Garifuna communities would simply accept new management. They did not. The Garifuna pushed back through property destruction, strategic intimidation, and making surveyors' lives so miserable that many abandoned their work and requested transfers to literally anywhere else. One surveyor wrote in his journal that the Black Caribs watch from the forest, and though they have not harmed us physically, their presence fills me with such dread I cannot sleep. Colonial records show frustrated British officials writing to London explaining that the Black Caribs refuse all authority and maintain their own government in defiance of the Crown. Governor Melville complained in an official dispatch that we have sovereignty in name only, as the interior remains under the control of hostile natives who acknowledge no British law. Imagine someone selling your house while you're still living in it, then getting mad when you won't move out. Empire 101. The 1763 surveys attempted to create legal reality through paperwork, as if mapping something made it yours, regardless of who actually lived there. British officials genuinely believed that drawing property lines on maps and recording them in ledgers meant those lines existed in physical reality, that Garifuna families who'd farmed valleys for generations would simply leave because a document in London said so. But paper empires can't survive forested reality, and the Garifuna had no intention of becoming British subjects just because a treaty said so. Tensions escalated daily through the late 1760s and early 1770s. The British wanted plantations. They'd invested money in land grants and needed return on investment. The Garifuna wanted their land. They'd defended it successfully for 50 years and had no reason to stop now. One side had documents. The other had mountains. The British had troops. The Garifuna had terrain. Conflict was inevitable, just a matter of timing. The First Carib War would settle nothing, but it would clarify exactly how determined both sides were. In 1772, the conflict erupted into open warfare when British troops attempted to enforce survey lines in the Buckamant Valley, and Garifuna fighters responded with coordinated ambushes that killed several soldiers and sent the rest retreating to coastal fortifications. Joseph Chattoyier emerged during this period as a paramount chief, coordinating resistance across multiple Garifuna communities through a combination of military skill, diplomatic finesse, and strategic vision that shocked British commanders who'd assumed savages couldn't organize sophisticated campaigns. Chattoyier understood that the Garifuna's advantage wasn't numbers or firepower. British troops had both, but mobility, terrain knowledge, and the ability to sustain resistance longer than Britain could sustain expensive military operations in difficult geography. He coordinated a defensive strategy that avoided pitched battles where British musket fire and artillery would dominate, instead employing hit-and-run tactics that attacked at dawn or dusk, using terrain advantage to strike and vanish before British forces could organize pursuit. Governor William Dalling's war reports describe British troops wandering in circles through mountain passes while Garifuna fighters observed from ridges above, occasionally rolling rocks down on columns, occasionally firing from concealment, always disappearing before British troops could retaliate. European soldiers accustomed to battlefield warfare where armies faced each other in lines found themselves utterly unprepared for guerrilla tactics that treated the entire island as a battlefield, with no front lines, no safe zones, no predictable engagement patterns. The war lasted through 1773 with neither side achieving decisive victory, but British casualties mounted while Garifuna communities remained intact and mobile. For every Garifuna fighter killed, Britain lost 3 soldiers to combat, disease, desertion, or accidents in unfamiliar terrain. Tropical diseases, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, killed more British soldiers than Garifuna weapons did. One military surgeon reported that the climate is more deadly than any enemy musket. Exhausted and losing men to tropical disease as much as combat, the British negotiated. The 1773 Treaty of Peace divided the island. The windward districts for Black Caribs, the northwest for Yellow Caribs, Kalinago, and the southwest for British settlers, with the Rabaka Dry River forming a formal boundary that British maps carefully drew and Garifuna leaders agreed to, knowing enforcement would matter more than paper. A British official wrote in private correspondence that the treaty represented practical acknowledgement that we cannot govern these people by force and must accommodate their independence or abandon the island entirely. Britain signs a treaty. Translation: fine, you win this round. The treaty bought breathing space, not peace, and both sides knew it. Chattoyier understood the British would violate it eventually. The British knew the Garifuna would resist when they did. The treaty was a pause, not a resolution, and the British immediately began planning how to violate it profitably. Between 1773 and 1795, the treaty existed mostly on paper, while British settlers repeatedly crossed the Rabaka Dry River boundary, establishing illegal plantations in Garifuna territory and claiming confusion about where borders actually were. Confusion is colonial code for, we know exactly what we're doing, but we'll pretend ignorance when caught. The boundary violations followed a pattern. Settlers would clear land just across the river, plant crops, build structures, then claim they'd made improvements that justified permanent occupation. When Garifuna communities objected, settlers would demand British military protection. The Garifuna responded by seizing livestock that grazed on their side of the river, destroying crops planted on disputed land, and making British encroachment expensive enough to discourage, but not violent enough to justify full-scale military retaliation. Chattoyier navigated this period with political precision, maintaining just enough pressure to defend territory while avoiding giving Britain an excuse to declare war. He understood that Britain wanted an excuse to void the treaty and needed to avoid providing one while still defending Garifuna sovereignty. Colonial land encroachment complaints filed in Kingstown show British settlers constantly demanding military protection while simultaneously admitting in their own petitions that they'd built estates beyond treaty boundaries. One settler wrote in 1784 that, "I have established my plantation 2 miles past the boundary, as the soil there is superior, and now the Black Caribs threaten my property, and the governor must protect British subjects." The circular logic was spectacular. Violate treaty, complain about consequences, demand military intervention. Plantation expansion ledgers reveal the economic logic. British planters knew Garifuna land was more fertile. Volcanic soil in the valleys produced higher sugar yields. So they claimed it anyway and expected the military to enforce their theft. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans on British plantations occasionally escaped to Garifuna communities, which absorbed them, further enraging planters who saw their property disappearing into the mountains and couldn't understand why anyone would prefer freedom in the forest over enslavement on sugar estates. The Garifuna weren't just defending their own freedom. They were offering it to others, creating refuge for anyone who rejected plantation slavery. If treaties were Wi-Fi terms and conditions, Britain clicked "agree" without reading, and then complained when the service didn't work the way they wanted. The pressure built steadily through 2 decades. Every stolen cow, every burned survey stake, every escaped enslaved person was a small war won. And pressure creates fighters. Revolution was coming, from France. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, its radical ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity spread across the Atlantic faster than any military could contain them. Revolutionary France abolished slavery in its colonies in 1794, and suddenly the Caribbean became an ideological battleground, as well as an economic one. By 1795, French Republican forces were active throughout the Lesser Antilles, seeking allies against British colonial power, and the Garifuna recognized an opportunity. Chattoyier negotiated with French Captain Duval and other Republican agents, coordinating a joint offensive that would combine Garifuna knowledge of terrain with French military supplies and naval support. The alliance made strategic sense for both parties. France needed local allies who knew the island and could move through terrain British forces couldn't navigate, while the Garifuna needed weapons and ammunition to sustain prolonged resistance against British military superiority in open warfare. British spy reports from this period reveal deep anxiety about the alliance, one official writing that the Black Caribs have formed an unnatural connection with French Republicans that threatens all British holdings in the Windward Islands. The word unnatural here means politically sophisticated in ways we didn't expect from people we considered savages. British intelligence had assumed the Garifuna were primitive warriors incapable of diplomatic maneuvering, and discovering they'd formed an international alliance challenged fundamental colonial assumptions about indigenous political capacity. The Garifuna weren't naive allies. They understood French Republicans might betray them later, that revolutionary ideals often stopped applying when it came to indigenous land rights. But immediate British expansion was the urgent threat, and French support could tip military balance in their favor. Revolutionary correspondence shows the Garifuna negotiating from a position of strength, demanding arms and ammunition in exchange for coordinated attacks, never surrendering political autonomy or accepting French authority. They wanted weapons, not masters. Caribbean alliances weren't accidents. They were strategy. The Garifuna had spent decades studying European warfare, noting its weaknesses, understanding that empires were never united and could be played against each other. By early 1795, the alliance was set. French forces would provide artillery support and naval bombardment of British coastal positions, while Garifuna fighters would conduct inland operations using their superior mobility and terrain knowledge. Britain panicked, sending reinforcements and preparing for the war everyone knew was coming. The Second Carib War would be the largest, bloodiest, and most coordinated resistance Britain had faced in the Caribbean. The Second Carib War exploded in March 1795 when Garifuna and French forces launched coordinated night attacks across multiple British positions, burning plantations from Mesopotamia to Caliacua and forcing British troops into defensive fortifications around Kingstown. The attacks demonstrated sophisticated planning. Simultaneous strikes prevented British forces from reinforcing each other, while targeting plantations destroyed the economic infrastructure Britain needed to justify military presence. Sugar works burned, cane fields went up in flames, estate houses collapsed into ash. The night sky glowed orange across the leeward coast. Chattoyier led from Dorsetshire Hill, a strategic ridge that provided visibility across the leeward coast and allowed rapid communication through signal fires. British military reports describe attacks coming as if coordinated by invisible means, which reveals more about British inability to understand Garifuna communication systems than actual mystery. The fire network that had operated defensively for decades now coordinated offensive operations, with lookouts signaling troop movements, attack timings, and retreat routes. The fighting was brutal through March and April. Garifuna forces used the dense forest to appear, strike, and vanish, while French artillery provided covering fire that kept British naval vessels at bay. French Republican ideology mixed with Garifuna liberation struggle in ways that terrified British commanders, who feared the combination of European military technology and indigenous tactical skill. For weeks, British forces marched in circles through mountain passes, ambushed repeatedly, losing men to combat, disease, and desertion. Soldiers wrote home describing nightmare conditions: heat, humidity, insects, disease, and an enemy that seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanish before retaliation was possible. Then, on March 14, 1795, during a battle near Vigier, Joseph Chattoyier was killed. Accounts differ on whether by British musket fire during an ambush or in single combat with a British officer named Major Alexander Leith. But his death was confirmed by multiple sources, including British military records and Garifuna oral tradition. Some accounts say he fought Leith with a cutlass on a narrow mountain trail, others that he was shot leading a charge. The truth likely died with witnesses, but the result was undeniable. The Garifuna had lost their paramount chief. His brother Duval immediately took command, and the fighting continued without pause. Garifuna political systems emphasized collective leadership rather than individual authority, so Chattoyier's death didn't collapse resistance the way British commanders hoped. Duval coordinated with other chiefs. Evidence suggests Chatillon, Duquesne, and other leaders mentioned in British reports, maintaining military pressure through the summer of 1795, despite increasing British reinforcements. Sir Ralph Abercrombie arrived in June 1795 with massive reinforcements from Barbados, additional regiments, artillery, supplies, eventually overwhelming Garifuna positions through sheer numbers. But British casualty lists reveal the cost. Hundreds dead, more wounded, entire regiments requesting transfer away from the island because Saint Vincent had gained a reputation as a death trap. Military records show that some British units lost more than half their strength to combat and disease combined. By October 1796, after 18 months of grinding warfare, the British had military control of the coastal areas and major valleys, but Garifuna communities still held the interior mountains. British troops marched in circles so much, the mountains probably started naming them. Resistance isn't chaos. It's choreography, every ambush carefully planned, every retreat strategically executed, every attack coordinated with others miles away. The Garifuna lost battles but never surrendered, never accepted defeat, never agreed to British sovereignty. Which left Britain facing a harder question. What do you do with a people who refuse to surrender, who'll continue resisting forever if left on the island? The British solution was exile. The seventh and final Garifuna War fought not with muskets, but through forced deportation. In June 1796, Governor J. Hunter ordered all Garifuna rounded up and imprisoned on Baliceaux, the small island visible from Urumain's coast, where thousands were held in conditions so horrific that British naval officers later testified to Parliament about mass death from disease, starvation, and exposure. The island had no infrastructure, no shelter, insufficient fresh water, and the British provided minimal food supplies for thousands of prisoners. Deportation lists record approximately 5,000 Garifuna initially captured. Entire communities rounded up from mountain settlements, coastal villages, refugee camps. Men, women, children, elderly, sick, all forced onto boats and transported to Baliceaux, where they were essentially left to die while British officials decided what to do with them. Eyewitness testimonies describe bodies buried daily, children dying from fever, elders succumbing to dysentery, families huddled in makeshift shelters made from palm fronds, while hurricanes swept the exposed island. Chattoyier's family was among those imprisoned, his widow, his children, his extended kin network. British records show they received no special treatment, no acknowledgement that Chattoyier had negotiated as a head of state, fought as a military commander, died defending his people's sovereignty. To the British, they were all just prisoners to be disposed of as efficiently as possible. By February 1797, only about 2,500 survived to be loaded onto ships bound for Roatan, an island off the coast of Honduras that Britain had recently claimed and needed populated as a strategic outpost against Spanish interests. The death toll on Baliceaux, nearly 50% mortality in 8 months, constitutes what modern international law would recognize as genocide. The voyage itself killed hundreds more, packed into holds with insufficient food and water, diseases spreading in confined spaces, bodies thrown overboard when they died. The survivors who reached Roatan in April 1797 stepped onto foreign shores carrying everything they had left: language, music, spiritual practices, and memory of mountains they'd never see again. They carried Dugu ceremonies in their memories, drum rhythms in their muscles, agricultural knowledge in their practices, political traditions in their community structures. They carried Chattoyier's name and the names of chiefs before him. They carried the knowledge that they'd fought 7 wars and lost none in spirit. British official correspondence refers to the deportation as removal of a troublesome population, the kind of bureaucratic language empires use when genocide sounds too honest. When empire can't beat you militarily, it uses paperwork and prisons and death camps disguised as temporary holding facilities. The Garifuna had won every war that mattered. They'd maintained their freedom, their culture, their dignity, their refusal to become British subjects or enslaved laborers. Britain won geography, control of an island, the ability to establish plantations without Garifuna resistance. Survival across the sea is still survival. Exile is not defeat. In Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, the Garifuna rebuilt from exile, establishing coastal communities that maintained the language, drumming traditions, and spiritual practices that defined their identity across generations and geography. The first settlements on Roatan's coast, at Punta Gorda, faced harsh conditions: unfamiliar ecology, hurricanes, limited resources, but Garifuna communities applied the agricultural and maritime knowledge they'd carried from Euromine. They cleared land for cassava and plantain cultivation using African farming techniques, fished coastal waters using canoes built with indigenous technology, and organized communities around matrifocal households where women controlled land and men provided labor. By the early 1800s, Garifuna communities had expanded from Roatan to mainland Honduras, establishing settlements at Trujillo, Limon, and other coastal towns. Spanish colonial authorities initially viewed them with suspicion, but eventually recognized their value as skilled fishermen, agricultural workers, and coastal defenders against British encroachment. Some Garifuna men served in Spanish military units, leveraging their warrior traditions into new contexts while maintaining distinct community identity. Thomas Vincent Ramos, a Garifuna teacher born in British Honduras in the 1880s, later worked to preserve Garifuna history and culture through written records and advocacy that eventually led to international recognition. Ramos documented oral histories from elders who remembered stories passed down from the deportation generation, recording names, battles, and political structures that might otherwise have been lost. His work in the early 1900s created archival foundation for later Garifuna cultural preservation efforts. Missionary reports from the 1800s describe thriving Garifuna settlements with their own governance structures, trading networks, and religious syncretism that blended Catholic saints with ancestor reverence in ways that scandalized priests but flourished anyway. Garifuna communities attended Mass, baptized children, married in churches, then conducted dugu ceremonies that Catholic authorities couldn't suppress because they happened in private spaces the church didn't control. Early census records show Garifuna communities maintaining distinct identity while adapting to new geographies, becoming fishermen, farmers, merchants, and eventually teachers, doctors, lawyers, professions their ancestors in Euromine had been denied. The dugu ceremony continued across exile, drums carrying rhythms across generations, each beat a refusal to forget. The ceremony evolved to incorporate new ancestors, those who died on Baliso, those who survived exile, those who built new communities, but maintained core spiritual technologies of communication between living and dead. Dance movements passed from grandmother to granddaughter, drum patterns from father to son, songs from community to community, creating cultural continuity that empire couldn't break even when it broke families apart through deportation. Language preservation became crucial. Garifuna parents taught children the language despite Spanish and English colonial education systems that punished indigenous language use. By the 20th century, linguists documented Garifuna as a living language with unique grammar combining Kalinago and West African structures, proof that cultural fusion creates something new that belongs entirely to the people who forged it. Culture carries itself when people refuse to let it die. Meanwhile, back in Saint Vincent, the island the British won struggled under a plantation economy that would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. While the people they exiled were building a diaspora that would outlast any empire, The Garifuna became Central Americans without ceasing to be Caribbean, maintaining connection to Yurumain through memory, story, and occasional pilgrimages by descendants who wanted to walk the land their ancestors defended. On August 1st, 1834, the British Empire formally abolished slavery in its colonies, replacing it with an apprenticeship system that kept formerly enslaved people bound to plantations for 4 to 6 years, under conditions barely distinguishable from bondage. The Slavery Abolition Act, passed Parliament in 1833, compensated slave owners for their property loss, while providing nothing to the people who'd actually been enslaved. £20 million went to planters, equivalent to billions in modern currency, while the enslaved received the privilege of continued forced labor called by a different name. Apprenticeship punishment logs from Saint Vincent show workers beaten for insolence, which often meant asking for wages, questioning work hours, or refusing to work when sick. The logs record punishments in bureaucratic language: 10 lashes for impudence, placed in stocks for laziness, confined to a state for attempted absence. The system was slavery with paperwork, designed to extract 4 more years of unpaid labor while technically complying with abolition law. By 1838, full emancipation finally arrived after apprenticeship's cruelty became too politically embarrassing to defend even by empire standards. But without land, tools, or capital, former enslaved Africans faced economic exploitation that differed from slavery more in legal theory than daily reality. Planters controlled all the fertile land, owned all the sugar processing equipment, controlled access to markets, and set wages so low that workers remained in perpetual debt. Freedom meant choosing which plantation to work for, not freedom from plantation labor itself. The sugar economy that had justified so much violence began its slow collapse as global competition and labor costs made Caribbean plantations less profitable. Brazilian and Cuban sugar produced by enslaved labor undercut Caribbean prices, while beet sugar from Europe captured markets that had sustained Caribbean plantations for centuries. Saint Vincent's plantations couldn't compete, and rather than pay competitive wages to free laborers, planters imported indentured workers from India and Portugal, creating new ethnic tensions while refusing to pay fair wages to Afro-Vincentian workers who'd been there for generations. Indentured Indian laborers arrived starting in the 1860s under contracts that promised wages, housing, and return passage to India after 5 years. In practice, they faced debt bondage, exploitative wage deductions, poor housing, and plantation discipline enforced by legal penalties. Portuguese workers from Madeira arrived in smaller numbers, facing similar exploitation, though with slightly better terms because European racism valued their labor more highly than Indian or African workers. The plantation system required racial hierarchy to function, so it created one through wage differentials, housing segregation, and deliberately fostering competition between ethnic groups. Through the late 1800s and early 1900s, trade unions formed slowly despite planter opposition and colonial laws restricting worker organization. Workers organized anyway because exploitation forced them to. The Kingstown riots of 1862 saw Afro-Vincentian workers protest wage cuts and working conditions, met with police violence but also eventual minor wage concessions. The 1935 labor uprising saw workers across the island strike for better wages and conditions, following Depression-era collapse in sugar prices. Police opened fire on strikers in Kingstown, killing several, but the uprising forced colonial authorities to acknowledge that labor relations couldn't continue unchanged. Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler, a Grenadian labor leader, influenced Vincentian workers through his radical organizing in Trinidad. George McIntosh and other local union organizers built worker associations that would eventually force political reforms. The 1935 uprising connected to broader Caribbean labor movements that were demanding voting rights, union recognition, and political representation beyond the small white planter minority who'd controlled colonial legislatures for centuries. Resistance remained generational, evolving from battlefields to labor halls, from chiefs to union organizers. The fundamental demand unchanged: dignity, autonomy, the right to live on your own terms and benefit from your own labor. The tactics changed: strikes instead of ambushes, petitions instead of night raids, union halls instead of mountain strongholds. But the struggle continued because plantation economies always required resistance. On October 27, 1979, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines achieved independence from Britain after centuries of colonial rule that began with theft and ended with negotiated withdrawal because empire became too expensive to maintain. The Union Jack lowered for the last time while a new flag rose bearing the colors of sun, sea, and resilience. Blue for the Caribbean, yellow for sunshine and warmth, green for the island's vegetation. Independence speeches invoked the spirit of Chattoyier, naming him national hero, acknowledging the Garifuna Wars as foundational to Vincentian identity, even as most Garifuna descendants lived scattered across Central America. Prime Minister Milton Cato, speaking at independence ceremonies, declared that we stand on the shoulders of those who resisted, who fought, who refused to accept that their land could be taken without their consent. The new national anthem included lines about freedom and resistance, deliberately connecting independence to the longer history of struggle that preceded it. Chattoyer's image appeared on currency, his name on schools and public buildings, his battles commemorated in textbooks that finally told Vincentian children that resistance wasn't terrorism but patriotism. Modern commemorations include Garifuna drumming performances during National Heroes Day celebrations, cultural festivals that feature Dugu-inspired dances, and historical markers at Dorsetshire Hill, where Chattoyier once stood planning resistance. The Garifuna Heritage Foundation, established in the 1990s, works to preserve language, music, and cultural practices, conducting educational programs and maintaining connections with Garifuna diaspora communities in Central America. Vincentian historians work to preserve oral histories, interviewing elders who carry stories passed down through generations, documenting place names and battle sites before memory fades completely. The diaspora maintains connections. Garifuna descendants visiting Euromine to walk the land their ancestors defended. Tours now operate to Dorsetshire Hill, Owia, Sandy Bay, places where Garifuna communities resisted empire. Guides tell stories of 7 wars, of Chattoyer's leadership, of exile and survival. Some descendants return permanently, reconnecting with land their families left in chains nearly 2 centuries ago. Though the return is complicated by the fact that Euromine is no longer Garifuna land. It's a modern nation-state with its own identity that includes but isn't limited to Garifuna heritage. UNESCO recognition of Garifuna language, dance, and music as intangible cultural heritage in 2001 provided international acknowledgement of what Garifuna communities had maintained through generations of exile. Culture survives when people refuse to let it die. The designation came from advocacy by Garifuna cultural organizations in Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, proving that the diaspora remained unified across national borders in ways that empire never destroyed. La Soufrière still rises above the island, smoking occasionally, erupting violently in 1979 just before independence, and again in 2021. Reminding everyone that the volcano witnessed everything and remains capable of reshaping the island regardless of who claims sovereignty. The camera returns to that volcanic peak now, smoke drifting from its summit as it has for millennia, indifferent to empires that rise and fall, treaties that are signed and violated, borders that are drawn and redrawn. A drum rhythm fades in, the same beat carried from Yurumine to Roatan, from exile to survival to pride. The rhythm is steady, complex, African and indigenous simultaneously, belonging to neither tradition, but to the Garifuna who created it. The beat continues in community centers in Honduras, in cultural performances in Belize, in homes across Central America, where grandmothers teach grandchildren rhythms that carry centuries. The island hasn't forgotten the people who defended it. The diaspora hasn't forgotten the island they defended. The mountains, the ridges, the ravines where resistance was choreographed still carry those footsteps, still echo with voices of people who refused to disappear. Dorsetshire Hill overlooks the same coast Chattoyier saw, though plantations have given way to tourism developments and cruise ship ports. The Rabaka Dry River still marks boundaries, though now they're administrative rather than military. The forest that sheltered resistance is smaller, logged and cleared, but still present in protected areas that conservationists fight to maintain. They tried to erase a people through 7 wars, through exile, through cultural suppression, through forced assimilation. Instead, the people became a continent-spanning nation without borders, a culture that exists in language and rhythm and memory, rather than territory alone, a diaspora that turned exile into expansion. The Garifuna survived everything empire threw at them and emerged with their identity intact, their culture alive, their resistance vindicated by the simple fact of continued existence. The drum keeps beating, the island keeps watching. The story continues.